Good morning, everybody, to this morning briefing of DGAP on the impact of sanctions. EU just agreed on the 10th sanctions package against Russia. It was not so easy, and there were also some compromises, but they agreed. One of the main aims of the Western sanctions are to reduce the ability to produce more weapons with regard to production, financing, but also, or first of all, technology. The idea is that Russia would be forced to stop the war or make at least some compromises if it's not able to produce more weapons. As we have seen during the last year, the Russian economy has adapted to the large-scale package much better than we have expected. The economic decline was smaller than everybody was forecasting. Russia is still able to produce weapons and munition, and it seems to be able in a bigger amount than Western countries are able to increase their production of weaponry. There are schemes to circumvent sanctions via Central Asia and Turkey, first of all, and we know that China and other Asian states are still supplying semiconductors. Russia is shifting towards a war economy, and the mobilization has produced and will lead even more to a shortage of labor. With the brain drain, the effect for the Russian economy is in middle and long-term negative. So I think we really have to look also into the short, middle, and long-term effects of the sanctions. I think this is very crucial. We often discuss mostly the short-term effects. So as I said, we want to discuss today the Russian war economy and the effects of sanctions. DGAP has recently published a paper on this topic, and there's an updated version from our director, Guntram Wolff, just out with IPQ. So I really recommend to read the paper. And we have excellent speakers today. So another good news. We have Sergei Guriev this morning, who is Provost at Sciences Po in Paris, and a former chief economist, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He is really one of the well-known experts and one of the best experts also on the Russian economy. Sergei, good morning. Happy to have you here today for this discussion. We have Guntram Wolff, director of DGAP, and who is also heading our center on geoeconomy and technology at the DGAP. Good morning, Guntram. Always great to have you. And we have Alexandra Prokopenko, who is a relatively new visiting fellow at my Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, also at the DGAP. First publication will be soon out. Very happy, Alexandra, also to have you at DGAP and have you here for the discussion.
My pleasure. Good
morning. So each speaker has 7 to 8 minutes for short input, and we should have at least half an hour for Q&As. That's at least my goal. I would start with Sergei and ask you what is the impact and what are the limits of the sanctions and how Russia is doing economically after 1 year of the war. So what is the picture also of the economy at the moment, please?
Thank you very much, Stefan and Guntram, for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. I see many familiar faces, many friends on my Zoom screen. I indeed will talk about the impact of the sanctions. If you think about the major sanctions that have been introduced in the last year, you can roughly put them in several buckets. Alexandra will probably talk more about individual sanctions, and I would identify 3 major kinds of sanctions that are the key sanctions that have macroeconomic impact. The first was the set of financial sanctions, most importantly, sanctions on Russian Central Bank. That was unexpected. I can talk more about that. But on the 3rd day of the war, all the Western countries, including Switzerland, which is a neutral country, have introduced sanctions against Russian Central Bank. Then sanctions on trade followed. This is something Guntram will talk about. Technological sanctions, sanctions against Russia importing sensitive technology. But also that was joined, the trade sanctions by governments were joined by voluntary exodus of international companies from Russia. About 1,000 companies exited to various extent. but still that reduced Russia's ability to import a lot of things, including actually goods which were not sanctioned. So, for example, European Union has always insisted it doesn't sanction pharmaceutical products, but some companies overcomply, so you have problems with getting some medicines in Russia. But anyway, so the second sanction was effective sanctions against imports. And the third kind of sanctions was sanctions against oil exports, which were discussed in the first months of the war. UK, US introduced oil embargo very early on. Europe announced oil embargo in the last days of May, first days of June, but the announcement actually included the actual introduction of sanctions only in December and February 2023. So these are the three kinds of sanctions that affected Russian economy. Stefan has said that initially people thought sanctions would have a much bigger impact. Indeed, because of this unexpected and unprecedented shock of sanctions against Russian foreign currency reserves, a financial panic followed. If you remember, the sanctions were introduced, sanctions against central bank were introduced on Saturday, third day of the war. Panic during the weekend followed. On Monday, Russian central bank closed down currency market, stock market, and so on. So it lasted for a few weeks. And during those few weeks, people thought that this is so unprecedented that Russian economy is going to have a decline of 8% or 10%. And it's not just Western experts who forecasted this. It's also central bank itself, Russian central bank, thought it would be a decline of 8% in 2022. Now, that didn't happen. The official number is minus 2%. And so some people would celebrate this as a victory of Russian economy. Now, I should say that, and I'm happy to talk about the specific measures of Russian central bank that stopped the panic in the spring. But I should say that even minus 2% is not such a great number for several reasons. One reason is before the war, IMF forecasted the Russian economy to grow by 3% in 2022. So it's already a big difference between +3 and -2. Second, the forecast before the war was based on a much lower oil price, and Russian GDP is very sensitive to oil price. So if not the war and if oil prices were higher, Russian GDP would probably grow even faster than 3% per year. And finally, of course, GDP measures are not very reliable indicators of economic activity during the war, because once you produce what Stefan mentioned, the Russian military complex now produces a lot more munitions and weapons. Once you produce, I don't know, $50 billion more of munitions, that means that you produce $50 billion more of GDP. It, of course, doesn't increase living standards, doesn't generate substantial improvement in investment. It's just GDP numbers. And so when we say that GDP didn't decline as much as it could, part of that is, of course, production of weapons and munitions. If you want to have a number on living standards, you can look at things like retail trade. And these numbers, Russian government just published a number which is much better than expectations of analysts. But if you look at monthly numbers were a decline of 8% or 10% year on year in the last months of, in the second half actually of 2022. So the spending of Russian households on consumer goods went down in comparable prices by 8 to 10%. And that, I think, reflects the decline in living standards. So that's a major decline. Now, one of the things which helped Russian government to stop the financial panic was disinflation. The decline in inflation was somewhat supported by stronger ruble, and stronger ruble was, of course, per se celebrated by Russian government as a sign of resilience of Russian economy, but it's actually just an implication of a combination of two things. Imports were sanctioned. De facto, imports went down by 40–50%, depending on the period, depending on the country. Russia could not import much from the West. And so you get dollars, but you cannot spend dollars. So dollar exchange rate should be weaker, ruble should be stronger by definition, especially given that oil prices were high and oil revenues continue to flow in. So we shouldn't be surprised that ruble became stronger and that actually reduced inflation. And then import sanctions themselves did contribute to a decline in GDP. The sectors which depended on imported technology, parts, cooperation with the West actually had a major hit. Year-on-year decline in car production, car sales is in the range of 60%. There are other sectors which were hit as well. So in that sense, stronger ruble is not as an indication of strong Russian economy. It's actually an indication of a weaker Russian economy because of impact of decline in imports. Now, to conclude, I would say that the markets also priced in sanctions on oil coming sooner. That didn't happen. Sanctions only started in December, and these sanctions actually made a huge difference. So there is still a debate to what extent oil embargo and oil price cap are going to work. But what we already see is the impact on the budget. And I think we know now that Putin will continue this war no matter what. But what we can do, and this is what the impact of sanctions is supposed to play a role, sanctions should reduce resources Putin has to continue this war. And so he will continue this war, but we need to make sure he has fewer petrodollars. And this is exactly what the sanctions seem to do. Now, there is a debate, what is the actual price Russian oil companies are getting from Indians and Chinese. The data on this are extremely controversial. Data for December are controversial. Data for January, disaggregated data have not come in yet. If you talk to Indians, some of them would say they pay actually less than $40. Some people would say they actually pay 70. So this is something to discuss. But we see that official data on budget on January and the first half of February, second half of February didn't come in yet. These data are extremely bad. And Alexandra will talk about that. But basically, Russian budget deficit in 2023 was supposed to be 2% of GDP. Now analysts are talking more about 5% of GDP. And that matters because Russia cannot borrow. Russia cannot print money because inflation is still high. Russian reserves are frozen. So the question remains how Russia will introduce some kind of austerity to figure out how to plug this big hole in GDP. IMF is optimistic. IMF believes that Russian banks have a lot of liquidities which they will lend to Russian government. This is not clear at all because data on Russian banks' balance sheets are not public. And we see some indications that some Russian banks want recapitalization. So the impact is there. The impact is there. And I think if you want to ask me what needs to be done in the future, one is to reduce oil price cap. Now it's 60. You need to go to 55, 50, 50, 45, 40 to really squeeze Russian budget and reduce resources Putin has. And the second thing is, of course, to plug loopholes in and prevent circumvention of the sanctions. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I think we should really later discuss also the role of the central bank. I think it's really, really crucial also how the management of the Russian economy worked. Can I just have a quick follow-up question? Because I think that's very important and not so much, it's also discussed, but maybe not so much discussed here. How do you see statistics at the moment? I think it's really a problem that there are less statistics also published. So how reliable are the numbers we are discussing here in this context?
Stefan, this is a great question, and I hope Alexandra will address it. My take is so much less is published now. So, for example, we don't have detailed budget statistics. You have leaks, and the papers I mentioned are sometimes based on leaks, and I highly recommend this paper by Tatiana Babina, Maxim Mironov, Oleg Itshoki, Elina Rybakova, who actually bought a leaked data set from Russian customs statistics and look at data on individual products exported, imported by Russia. And this data, they've not managed to buy it for January. Maxim told me that the guys who are selling this data said January data are especially expensive. So, and Maxim is not poor, but turns out that even for him, it's a challenge. But I highly recommend this paper, which is available on SSRN, but it's also a paper at Free Russia Foundation. And data for December are very controversial, but data for December are too early because oil sales in December are all oil contracts signed in November and October. So it's still before the oil sanctions. So, but many data which are published, normally I would say whatever is published should be trusted. But sometimes I see data series which don't add up. each other. And so I'm really concerned about this. So, but I guess Alexandra will talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. And let's shift to Guntram and the question on the impact of the sanctions on the military production. Please, Guntram, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Sergei and Alexandra, for being here with us. And Sergei, you said already many points that I also had on my list, in particular on the impact of the various sanctions on the broader economy, and also how the Russian economy has adjusted and how the government has deliberately adjusted the economic management of the economy. And so let me start by saying this is a war not just of people, but also of material. And if we look at the actual destruction of military equipment by Russian military equipment, it's humongous. So these are really huge numbers. The UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace came out with some numbers that amount to more than 4,500 armored vehicles, 63 fixed-wing aircraft, 70 helicopters, 150 unmanned aerial vehicles, 12 naval vessels, 600 artillery systems, and the list goes on. So this is the material that has been destroyed in the first 10 months since February 2022. So Russia had to adjust its economy, had to adjust its military production so as to keep up the material, and actually have the material necessary to continue the war. Now, the economic base for keeping up that production has declined, as Sergei pointed out, has declined somewhat, but much less than forecast. And the crucial issue why the decline has been less than forecast, one of the crucial issues, I would say, has been the ineffectiveness of the sanction regime on fossil fuels last year. There was a lot of discussion last year on how to sanction, but in effect, the oil sanctions in particular, which are the most relevant ones in terms of the revenues for the Russian state, really came into effect only now. And that's why it is so difficult also now to really assess the impact of these sanctions on the actual revenues of the Russian state, because there's very few data. It's really just in effect for a few weeks. And the first budget data, as Sergei pointed out, are really showing that there seems to be a significant drop in revenues for the Russian state. As of January, and so that certainly gives some hope that that there's some resource limits for the state. Now, what the Russian state has managed to do, it has managed to shift budgetary resources away from non-military spending to military spending. The official public spending item for defense for the federal budget is now above 5% of GDP. On top of that, there is evidence that regional budgets are being used to equip Russian soldiers, in particular those that are newly drafted. And so these numbers are not included in the actual 5% number. And as Stefan and Sergei already pointed out, the transparency of the data has really gone down quite a lot. So these numbers might actually be much higher, but that's the last official number that I found, the 5% on military spending. So really quite a massive shift towards a war economy. And let me emphasize, this is what I would call a war economy. There has been sometimes this term war economy being used here for Germany or Western Europe or even the US, that we need to shift towards a war economy. Well, that's not exactly what is needed here. On the contrary, what is needed here is an increase in military production, but we are talking here of orders of magnitude of 0 point something of GDP. while in Russia, it's really about several percentage points of GDP, the adjustment. So just to get the order of magnitude right. So what has impacted, how has this been impacting Russian military production? And, you know, there in this paper that we published in February, Russia's war economy, we really point out a number of factors. The first is that there has been, beyond the oil sanctions, there have been very significant export restrictions that limit access of the Russian military industrial complex to certain technologies and certain products that are crucial for the production of military equipment. Now, this has been starting as of 2014. There have been defense contracts cancelled. So that had already some effect on Russia's military equipment. But in particular, since February, there has been a whole range of additional restrictions, export restrictions imposed on Russia in 10 consecutive sanction packages. And those restrictions have had effects on the military production of Russia. And I mean, just to give you, I mean, the paper really has a lot of details in terms of, you know, what production sites have been affected, how. And that's mostly based on sort of local sources that study that, and so just to give you a few examples, so for example, the production of trucks, military trucks by Kamaz, has had to stop last year, in part because you know, there are certain fuel injectors for the engines that were provided before the war by the German company Bosch, and that then wouldn't be available anymore. And so as a result, you produce less trucks. No? So that's a very sort of simple mechanism. And these trucks are of course, important also for some defense, air defense systems and others. I mean, this is just one example. So what has happened, of course, is that the adjustment in Russia last year has not just been on the budget side, and I described how Russia has devoted more resources to defense spending, but has also been on really the production capacity of the industrial military complex. And I would say there's really quite a number of important adaptation measures that I want to mention here. The first is that Russia has increasingly found ways of circumventing high-tech sanctions by receiving imports via third countries that did not join the sanction regimes, such as China, Kazakhstan, and Turkey. Or even through shadow firms and brokers that have not have basically circumvented or even criminally undermined sanction regimes in Western countries. The second important adaptation measure is that there still have been quite some pre-war stockpiles that could be used and that have been mobilized. So, for example, there is a discussion on the KH-101 cruise missile system that continue to be produced, even though some chips needed weren't delivered anymore. And we don't know whether that's because some of the chips came in through circumvention or because there were some stockpiles of those chips. The third important adaptation measure, and we have seen that very strongly last year, end of last year, have been imported weapons from third countries, Iran and North Korea in particular. The fourth big measure has been the redesigning of weapon systems so that you basically managed to operate to produce these weapons without the Western imports. Yeah, so fuel injectors, just to give this example again, you don't have to use the Bosch fuel injector. I guess you can at some stage find a domestic producer who produces something that is perhaps less efficient, but still works. And
One or
finally,
2 more minutes, Guntram.
yeah, I'm finishing one point. And the final point is the deconservation of Soviet-era weapon systems. So a lot of old weapon systems have been pushed to the battlefield and really just been modernized. So what does the paper recommend? Well, it really recommends not to think sanctions don't work, but on the contrary, sanctions do work. But as time goes on, Russia adapts to sanctions, finds ways around these sanctions. And therefore, it's crucial now to look very clearly and quite in a detailed way what kind of sanctions are circumvented, where are they circumvented or bypassed, what kind of measures can be taken to ensure the enforcement of these sanctions, and how can we thereby continue putting pressure on the industrial military complex in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hand over to Alexandra that we also have some time for questions. So what is the impact on the tech sector and also impact on the elites? I think that would be also interesting to discuss. So looking maybe deeper also inside of Russia. Please, Alexandra.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for having me here. I'll try to be brief to save more time for a discussion. So speaking about tax sanctions, they are choking Russian economy. And I need to remind you that a year from now, Russian government expected that tax sanctions would be the most painful for Russian economy. And when they ran stress test, and there was in public that depriving of Russian businesses from chips, semiconductors, hardware, and software would be really painful, and this pain is comparable to the swifting or other severe measures. So what Stefan is already mentioned that, and as we know also from Russian media, from media and leaked statistics, that Russian firms are massively buying chips, semiconductors, and hardware from China, Hong Kong, and also from former Soviet countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia. And they also use different schemes of sanctions circumvention. I want to point that there was one recent poll held by Gaidar Institute where more than 15% of respondent businesses said that they continue to receive sanctioned hardware and equipment. 15%, it's a lot. If last year was the year of imposing sanctions, and so this year should be a year of its implementation. And I think if Western countries begin to actively apply secondary sanctions against not only intermediary firms, but also countries, this flow more highly likely will decrease. So on financial sector, which is a blood system of Russian economy, sanctions are, we see that sanctions are working, and most painful for them, for Russian banks and financial institutions, was leaving of Oracle, Cisco, IBM, SAP, and other firms. There were polls that also indicate that 1 in 2 Russian companies were left without technical support, and domestic alternatives were simply not available. And the current state of equipment and operational systems allows for a certain margin of safety, but the inability to purchase new hardware and software and other products in future means that banks will be forced to abandon the development of new products and reallocate resources towards critical services. And also the absence of foreign equipment and software will ultimately negate Russia's previous technological advances. It's very interesting how this digitalization evolved from a fetish to a vulnerability. And instead of generating innovative solutions and expanding internationally, including neighboring markets, Russian tech companies and Russian financial sector will be forced to pause their development, which means that they will be, sooner they will be behind the other countries, and it will abandon its leading positions. And well, business are unhappy with this, and there is nothing they can do. And also, the Russian government and is driven by Putin's orders and forced them to make this import substitution, and there is no local base and no local hardware and no local equipment to make this import substitution. Well, as Sergei and Stefan already mentioned, that the government and the central bank are stabilized the economy last year. So GDP contraction was only 2.1%. But in terms of growth of Russian economy, I think it's more important to speak about not numbers of the current year, but much more interesting how sanctions affect the potential growth. And if they're on my estimates, sanctions are the potential growth, which wasn't actually high before the war, now reduced to 1% of GDP. So in terms of people's well-being, it's literally nothing. I mean, really nothing. So then, which is also important, that Russia, what we see, that Russian government stopped falling. So they didn't fall into planned economy, and they leave businesses to adjust to this new normality, new reality itself, and Russian firms, because, well, and I think that they're doing this successfully mostly because they get used to crisis. They always are waiting that something bad will happen, and this explains the big amounts of stockpiles. That explains how quickly they were able to manage to redistribute its supply chains, to manage new suppliers, and but it also means that Russians are paying a high transactional cost on this. And well, Russian businesses are still facing problems, and these problems are logistics, transactions, and raising fees. For instance, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, I saw on internet the advertise of proxy firm who has offices in Turkey and Hong Kong and offers its services legal, providing bank account in dollars, euros, RMB, liras, and logistics service and consultancy to any Russian firms, sanctions or not sanctions, with the very modest fee, 5% from the total cost of the contract. And there are thousands, I think dozens or even hundreds of these proxy firms operates in Turkey, in Hong Kong, and other jurisdictions. And this should be a target of further sanctions. And speaking about elites, it's very important. 1 or 2 more minutes. Please. And speaking about elites, my colleagues from the Bell and I have recently interviewed several current officials and Forbes members. And first and foremost, they are concerned for their personal safety and the safety of their businesses. So that's why, and these concerns force them to be silent about their true relations to the war. They're strictly against it. But they are also not rushing to rally around Putin, so we don't see the effect of rally around the flag. And they are afraid to publicly state their dissatisfaction with the war because of the risks of their businesses. And they anticipate that this year the situation would be so this new normality will be used to redistribute assets from disloyal businessmen to the loyal ones. They see how Russian government now trying to get some extra money for Russian budget, and there was Also, there were presented new formula for calculating oil and gas taxes, and there are discussions about one-time contributions for their businesses. And business is extremely unhappy and feared that this voluntary payment, we'll see in March the amount and how it will be proceeded, would create a blood bond between Russian entrepreneurs and the Russian army force, which is highly unlikely to them. So, I can describe the situation as a very negative equilibrium, which is extremely fragile. And one more point about the statistics, as Sergei asked me to do, statistics is, of course, much less than it was. And we can, and we're using leaks data, which is reliable, but with some caveats. I think GDP and inflation numbers are still okay. They are still fine and they're credible. And most complaints about these numbers are about the way how Eurostat designs this data and the timing of publication, but still the methodology, there is no methodological claims. In this time, when leadership hides statistics, we have polls, which are extremely important, and we have polls of businesses held by different Russian institutions, and I think it's reliable data, and to check the temperature, what's happening in Russia. And I strongly recommend you to follow central bank regional economy reports. The next one, I think, is coming up next week, where we see what's happening in Russian regions, which is important to understand what's happening on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Can we stop here at this point?
Yeah, I will stop here. Thanks.
Just to have some questions, yes, because there are a lot of questions coming in. Thank you very much. I think very interesting also details you shared with us. I really would like to bring in the people to ask their questions. Yeah, so I prefer really spell out questions. I can read them also, but if some of the people who have written down some of the questions just raise their hands, I would be also happy. And I will always start with those people who ask questions directly. So Thomas O'Donnell, please, you're the first. I would collect and then give it back to the panel.
There we go. Did that work?
Yeah,
hello?
That works. And introduce yourself, very short.
Sure, Tom O'Donnell. I'm a global fellow at the Kennan Center, Wilson Center in Washington, and I teach at FU here now. I work on energy and international affairs. So I just wanted to say, I wish people had talked a little bit more about oil. I had to look into some detail this week. It's a kind of complex situation, and it's not really clear the effect. I mean, the whole idea of the nuclear sanctions, and this is both to Guntram and the Sergei, but anybody who wants to deal with this, the sort of nuclear sanctions on the bank in the beginning denied Russia all this foreign exchange, but they pretty much were able to build it up. The European sanctions kind of came slowly, and then Yellen had this idea. Well, anyway, Yellen had this idea of this price cap. So, okay, I understand, why that is. They didn't want to shock the market. Now, Larry Summers said this week he thinks it's important now to squeeze that price cap. And what I'm saying, yes, Fatih Birol has said that there's a 40% drop in the income January versus January before the war, which is very good. But at the same time, if you look at work by Ben Aris at BNE here, he shows that a number of Russian companies are holding their profits abroad. And in fact, Putin is demanding that they sort of make a voluntary tax and send it back inside of Russia. So it's a kind of a mixed idea there, and they're still getting a lot of money from oil. And I think with this price cap on the products, it's going to be till April until we can really tell, because of the length of time it takes to have ships go so far to India. Mm-hmm. And in India and in China, the difference is that they might not want to take diesel like they might want to take crude oil because they're making money on the crude oil, refining it. But also there's a lot of paperwork the banks are imposing in India. So it's a mixed situation. I just like a little more discussion. I can't really go into my analysis. I don't want to do that. I just want I like a little more discussion of how it's going.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Nikolai von Schöpf.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this interesting briefing, Auswärtiges Amt. I have three concrete questions on effectiveness of the sanctions. First, Mr. Pappberger, the CEO of Rheinmetall, said here in Berlin publicly that Russia is producing 20 times more artillery every month than the US. and also on the spot regarding Ukrainian ammunition, 5 times more they use every day. So the question of the effectiveness. Then second, on individuals, the EU sanctions comprise about 1,000 high-level Russians. If you take the FSB, it's already 20, 30 times more. And if you see Abramovich sanctions, now a citizen of Portugal, and the program of golden visa of Cyprus going ahead. Third, majority of countries in the world, in my opinion, don't support the EU sanctions. We have explicitly so-called Western countries like Turkey, you have Mexico, you have United Arab Emirates, who explicitly don't support the sanctions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yannick Hartmann.
Yeah, hi, Sergei. Thank you very much for your interesting input on the oil sanctions.
Introduce yourself, please, very short.
Yeah, sure. Yannick Hartmann, DGAP, student assistant. And yeah, I would be very interested actually to hear from you whether you think Russia has the ability to circumvent the oil sanction using or increasing its dark ship, its fleet on ships that are not reliant on the EU, and whether this is also possible, keeping in mind that it is still really reliant on the insurances. Thank you.
I would maybe read out here some of the questions since people are not coming in. So there is a question on the impact and the adaptation of the sanctions by James Willey. There's a long and distinguished literature on poor track record of civil economic sanctions, achieving high political and strategic goals. How target states can mitigate the economic impacts of economic sanctions. So why do high politics makers persist in pursuing such Gester strategies? So does this really has the effect, and how this is discussed in such a way? I think that would be the first question. I think here from Daniel Gross, it's also important point. Does the binary view on sanctions works or not work is not very useful, and the sanction impose a cost evasion is costly. So the key question is how costly evasion is, and thus the magnitude of the cost of sanctions. Reducing Russia's economy by only 5 to 10% would already represent an important factor in this war of attrition. So I think also this the public discussion, about do they work or not work, how useful this is and on what to look. So I would. Here's from that. Maybe I take the question also from Niels Kreimeier. What was the impact of sanctions on individual entities like Prigozhin's company and the Wagner Group? That would be also a question from my side. You didn't mention so much the person sanctions here, so they seems to be not so relevant. We are discussing maybe too much also the oligarchs in a way. So I take maybe one more question, because if I'm giving it back and then start again, we will not have time. So I take Maria Pastuchova. I would take one more questions and then I would give it back to the panel.
Good morning and many thanks all for the exciting contributions. Maria Pastuchova, Senior Policy Advisor, working on energy diplomacy at E3G. I have a question. There was a question raised about oil. I have a question about gas, and apologies if you mentioned it in the first couple of minutes because I came a bit late. I mean, gas is not under sanctions right now and kind of out of the picture because Europe doesn't receive much of the Russian pipeline gas anymore. But the question is about the liquefied natural gas, or LNG, which volumes have increased 50% last year in terms of imports to Europe. They're not just going directly, but also going via China, who didn't have that much demand for this Russian LNG and has been reselling to the European market. And this is not under sanctions. On the other side, we have seen that there was this new legislation Russia proposed to tax LNG, which was not there before. So the question to you is whether you consider this becoming a potential cash cow. I know the volume is much less than what Russia sells in terms of oil, but is it something that needs to be considered in terms of future sanctions? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just add two quick, very short questions. To Alexandra, what is the role of the state in the tech sector? So how does the role of the state is changing also in this sector? And maybe to Guntram and to Sergei, I don't know who wants to answer this. So what does war economy mean? You mentioned several points, but I think it's still much more also about how the economy is reorganized. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on this? Maybe Sergei, we start with you again. Yeah, so let's
Thank you, Stefan. I'll go quickly through the list. These are excellent questions. So on Thomas' question, the idea of oil price cap was actually raised by Mario Draghi in the first week of the war, and the credit goes to him. He talked about oil price cap for gas rather than for oil. But I really recognize the efforts of the Treasury, which actually traveled around the world during summer and convince all the non-Western countries that they're serious about oil price cap, and that really helped. And I think whatever we think about whether it works or not, and I fully agree, it's too early to judge. This is unprecedented, and this is something we've not seen before. And the fact that it's been announced, agreed, and is functioning is a huge achievement already. And well, whatever we say, Russian budget is in trouble. Now, on oil price, and oil profits, oil price being higher than we observe, and Russian oil companies moving money abroad, that's not bad. That's actually not bad, because if Russia is bleeding cash and Russian government cannot get that money as a tax, that's the goal. Now, the question is if Russian government will be able to get this money out of oil companies. That's exactly what Russian government is trying to do now. They say, well, we suspect that you're hiding oil profits abroad, so we will tax you not based on contract price, but we'll tax you on Brent minus, and we'll just assume that you're hiding money abroad. I don't know if it's going to work, but that's already an achievement if oil companies are not paying this tax. Now that is related to the war economy question. To what extent the rules of the game have changed? We do have a discussion that Russian government came to non-oil companies and said, you need to pay extra tax. But that's happened before the war as well. So this particular individual, Deputy Prime Minister Belousov, whom I happen to know for many years, is not a big supporter of liberal principles and market economy. So for him, it's normal to come to business and say you have to pay. Now, the businesses have not yet agreed to pay. So the rules of the games are not yet a Stalinist economy or 1940s economy. The spending on defense has increased a lot, but it is still a state capitalism market economy with a huge share of the state, huge increase in defense spending. This is something that Guntram will say. That also relates to Nikolai's question about artillery production. I think it's also a question for Guntram. On individual sanctions, and I will not talk about Prigozhin. I think it's important to sanction Prigozhin also for African adventures of Prigozhin. But on individual sanctions generally, I think there are many Russian oligarchs who are extremely unhappy about being sanctioned in the West. And they all are aware that if they speak against Putin, that will actually protect them from Western sanctions. But they're afraid of doing this because they have businesses in Russia, friends in Russia, family in Russia, and because they may be poisoned by Putin. And this is something that they don't talk about publicly, but they all realize that. That applies to oligarchs, that applies to high-level officials. Some of them know that exiting is extremely dangerous and costly. Now, the reason why sanctions are introduced against them is if they're afraid of Putin, Putin can ask them to do things for Putin. And so their billions they have in the West become potentially Putin's instruments. And so I think the West has a lot of reasons to freeze those assets. So Nikolai also asked a question about non-Western countries. That's right. Non-Western countries don't think it's their war. They have a lot of reasons to be unhappy about the Western behavior before the war, the vaccination story, the story of 100 billion promised to developing countries for fighting climate change, and the West reneging on this 100 billion commitment. There are also the fact that Western civil society is very unhappy about Ukrainian war, but and is welcoming the Ukrainian refugees, while Syrian refugees were treated differently. The developing countries are saying it's racism, and it is. So all of that is coming back at the West, and the West should rethink how we treat this relationship. But overall, if the non-Western countries don't support those sanctions, the secondary sanctions are a very important tool, and that's why countries may be forced to comply with Western countries. And that brings me to Yannick's question on dark fleet of tankers, oil tankers. So secondary sanctions are important to ask Indian buyers to comply with Western sanctions. But on top of that, price cap is a great instrument because it's incentive compatible. Indian government wants cheaper oil for Indian businesses and Indian households. That's the job of Indian government, which is very open about this. They say, if Russian oil is cheap, we'll buy Russian oil. And that's great. And that's great. That's exactly the goal of oil price cap. And Indian ministers call their friends in Moscow and say, we love you. We are not supporting the sanctions, but we have to comply because they impose it on us. They threaten secondary sanction. But between each other, Indian ministers say, but we also benefit from oil price cap because we have cheaper oil. On James Willis' question about literature and poor record of the sanctions, I agree with James that sometimes sanctions don't achieve their goal. But we should not forget what the goal of the sanctions is. The goal of the sanctions is not to change the regime, it's to change the behavior. Most recently, the sanctions on Iran changed Iran's behavior. Iran has signed a deal, JCPOA. That happened. Iranian regime has not changed. Iranian economy has suffered greatly, but did not fall apart. Now, Russian macroeconomic management is much more competent than Iranian macroeconomic management, so Russia is not going to have a runaway inflation. But the idea here is to make sure Putin has less money to buy Iranian drones. And that is happening right now. And one of the indications I would just mention, Putin from the very start of the war said, I will not run mobilization. I will recruit soldiers. I will not force Russians to fight for me, because mobilization was highly unpopular. And then he was eventually forced to do mobilization. Why? Because he was starting to run low on cash. And that's in economics, we say it's a revealed preference. The talk is cheap, but we need to watch the actions. And in that sense, sanctions are depriving Putin of resources, and they're doing that more and more. And Guntram was talking about, and Alexandra were talking about the tech sanctions. That's also important. On Daniel Gross' view, binary, non-binary view on sanctions, I fully agree. I fully agree. And I think minus 10% is a big shock already. And if Putin has less money to finance this war, that saves lives as we speak, and that saves Ukrainian cities from being destructed every day. And I think it's great. Now, IMF just published to
the others also.
Yeah.
Just
Okay, good. I'll say something about 10%. IMF has published an update in January, updated forecast, which was more optimistic. I think that IMF is too optimistic about the state of the Russian banking system. But if you actually look at the long-term forecast of IMF before and after the war, the gap in the long-term GDP trend is 10%. So 5 years down the road, Russian GDP will be 10% below than before the war. And so this is not good for Russia, not good for Putin's ability to fight the war. I can also answer a question about the gas, but I'll leave it for others. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it was already excellent, all these very, very interesting answers. Guntram, please.
I think so many points were already answered by Sergei, but let me also start with the aim of the sanctions. I mean, just to be very clear, in the public debate, there is often this perception sanctions should sort of magically work and change the regime and completely change the behavior and stop the war. Well, that's not what the sanctions can achieve, and that's not what is the stated goal of these sanctions. The stated goal of these sanctions is to weaken the military and economic base of Russia. I mean, that's what is in the council statements very clearly spelled out. The question then is, to what extent and how strongly do these sanctions affect the military and economic base for Russia to fight this war? And I think what we have shown is in the various papers and in today's discussion is that this is, of course, not a binary question, but a question of degree, right? A degree, how much does it really affect? And that brings me, I guess, to my second point, which is on the oil. We heard a strong question on the oil. let me emphasize the point that last year, so all of 2022, there were no sanctions on oil, and it was it is the biggest revenue source of Russia. And the quantities that Russia could sell last year were higher than in 2021. And all of that in a period where prices were actually skyrocketing. Now, we can debate why prices have been skyrocketing. I think an important factor why prices went up so much was that we continue talking about sanctions. And if you talk about sanctioning the second most important oil producer and the first most important gas producer in the world, well, what do markets do? Well, of course, the prices shoot through the roof because everybody is stocking on that product that possibly might experience a major negative supply shock. So we talked about it, we didn't implement it. Russia managed to sell more than before at higher prices. Well, that means they had really abundant dollars last year in all kinds of accounts available. And of course, if you have a lot of dollars, that helps you not only to cushion your domestic economy from other sanctions, but it also helps you to use that money outside of the country and buy weapons, buy chips, buy material, buy favors, etc. So that brings me to my second point, which is on the individuals, the sanctioning of individuals. I totally agree with Sergei. The key here is that it limits also their room to maneuver and to operate outside of Russia. And I think this is really quite important because the sanction circumvention works in a way that you need people outside of the country to have the resources and actually buy the stuff that is needed and operate through third countries. So this is on the sanctions. Now, then there was a question on the artillery production and the overall capacity to produce. And I think the message from our paper is in a sense a depressing message that Russia still has a lot of capacity to actually move resources towards the military-industrial complex. Now, at what stage you call it a war economy? I mean, there's gray zones here, right? I mean, my view is there is a significant shift of resources in that direction, and it has the resources still to shift more, and it's doing so the Kremlin can do so by squeezing other spending items. And, there's some evidence that other spending has been cut by 10%, similar numbers. And, that's possible if you control the information space domestically. So this is what is happening. The production is very high, and that does mean, just to be very clear on this, that in the West, we have to increase our own weapon production so as to be able to deliver the necessary amounts of ammunition and weapons to Ukraine. We have to do so. This is now happening. Germany has done so very lately, and we have a long domestic debate. The German defense minister had to leave. I would say the key issue was that we were very slow in ordering the necessary weapons. But again, I mean, just to give you a flavor and an understanding, this is in our Western economies, this is a relatively small macroeconomic adjustment. I mean, it's not that this is a sort of major amount of resources that we have to sort of now devote to producing weapons. Not at all. I mean, these numbers are small. The deliveries of weapons to Ukraine cost the 5 top exporters to Ukraine in the order of magnitude of 0.1, 0.2% of GDP. I mean, that's the kind of numbers we are talking about. So on the whole, I would say
2 more minutes. We just have
yeah. So I mean, look, on perhaps one last point on the gas. So as you rightly pointed out, the gas exports to the West through the pipeline system stopped because Russia stopped them, not because we sanctioned them. Russia doesn't have the pipeline infrastructure to send the gas to the East. There's a little bit of pipelines, but it's really very difficult to substitute these huge amounts to export them somewhere else. But of course, there is some increase in LNG, but I haven't looked at the actual numbers, how much LNG is now exported by Russia compared to what was exported through the pipeline system. But I think it must be a fraction of the pipeline exports. But this is worth double checking. Let me stop here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And Alexandra, for 4 minutes.
I'll go for 2 brief questions about tech sector and individual sanctions. Speaking about tech sector, as I said, the companies here are doing their best to survive through this coming situation, and major problems is here shortages of hardware and software. And recent, there was recent publications indicates that the speed of mobile internet outside Moscow was lowered because of shortages of hardware. Then the second problem for tech sector is brain drain, and most part of those who abandoned Russia during last year were IT people. The competition for those who remained are extremely high. Their salaries are skyrocketing, which is also pro-inflationary factor. And the third and very important shift in tech sector is that less of competition brings only two or three state-run players in the market, which also bad for the development of the sector itself because it's lack of competition and the state actually we see how state think about this tech sector as as an extension of the state or as an extension of the government. They not consider it as an ordinary businesses, as a real businesses. And speaking about individuals, of course, I completely agree with Sergei that it's important to sanction Prigozhin, especially for what he's doing and he's continued to do in Africa. And there is also evidence that he operates in Afghanistan and in some parts of and he also in Asian countries. But what I've heard from individuals that so why they're choosing Putin, because Putin is the devil they know, and there is no guarantee that if they will go against the Putin, the sanctions will be removed. And there is no facility, there is no mechanism to them to go through that, to go through sanctions. Is it so they don't know, do they need to go to the court, or they need to go, or there is any administrative facility? So if maybe the discussion will start in this year, we will see much more vocal businesses first, because they are really extremely unhappy with individual sanctions, and maybe more high-ranked officials who are now trying to quit their jobs. It's really uneasy now. The position, the higher position you get, it's more complicated to resign. So maybe if they see some way how the sanctions can be removed, maybe we'll see more of them who are opposed to the war, and who they will be more vocal on this. But yeah, so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank, first of all, the 3 speakers. I think very good discussion. It's really a complex topic. I think it's very interesting to open up this box and to have the different also the different angles of it. I think it's good to set these kind of topics also here in this morning briefing. So I really thank you 3. I thank the auditorium who has joined again for this session. And we're looking forward for the next discussions. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.